Well, you made it. Chapter 24 overview. Nice job. Last chapter of the book. Accelerating Global Interaction, 1945 to the present. This chapter is about globalization intensifying and the world that we live in getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So the main idea... Oh, shoot, I forgot the music. Hold on a second. Let me find... Dadgummit!
It's a world of laughter, a world of tears. It's a world of hopes and a world of fears. There's so much that we share that it's time we're aware. It's a small world after all.
Okay, sorry about that. You're welcome, by the way, for the music. So the main idea of the chapter is that the processes of economic integration intensified in the second half of the 20th century, creating a global economic network with significant social, political, environmental, and cultural consequences. Relevance. So this chapter is really the culmination of our course. It describes the world that we live in, which, as you know, is dominated by globalization. Our lives are filled with products that are the product of a global economy: electronics, food, clothes, and more. So this interconnectedness has created challenges for us as well, and your book in this chapter is going to review some of those challenges. So setting the stage. There are 4 spice categories in particular that are reviewed in this chapter. Remember that industrialization spread around the world in the 20th century, and that cheap labor moved manufacturing overseas. You know, we don't see a lot of products that say made in the USA anymore, and that is a product of globalization. Also remember that the independence movements that were discussed in chapter 23 influenced feminist movements around the world. So there's a social aspect to this chapter. Also remember that developing nations have been dealing with Western influence since the 19th century, back to the Opium Wars, and that is going to be an issue in the 20th century and even the 21st, and relating to the rise of religious fundamentalism. And finally, the increasing industrialization of our economy has created environmental concerns, and the green movement is a product of the 20th century. So your book will discuss all of these in order, starting with the transformation of the world economy. During the second half of the 20th century, global institutions and agreements helped encourage the development of a global capitalist economy. Reglobalization. World trade is based on the movement of money in a variety of different ways, and your book is going to go over them. One of the main features is major corporations called transnational corporations, which produce and sell goods in many countries and become very rich and powerful as a result. And McDonald's is an example of a transnational corporation. So in this global economy, countries are buying and selling from each other in very complex ways. And here's a map from your book that shows the investment funds, and you can see that the United States, which is this purple, represented by this purple arrow, is investing in lots of countries, but they in turn are investing in the United States. So there's a back and forth relationship with Europe. So this globalization has also created a new wave of migration, which will be covered in this section in your book. The next heading is called Growth, Instability, and Inequality. There has been incredible economic growth in the second half of the 20th century. The global economy was worth about $7 trillion in 1950 and almost $56 trillion in 2003. And this is a direct result of a policy called neoliberalism, which involves less government involvement in the economy and policies designed to encourage trade. So you can see in this map of world population distribution, the bigger the country, the bigger the population. And also in this map, economic development, the bigger the country, the richer the country. Compare these maps in your book because they're important and give you definitely some insight into what's going on in this global economy. Your book is going to raise a few issues and dangers in this global economy. One of them is that because the economies are linked together, their fates are linked. And it's going to use the U.S. housing market crash from 2008 as an example of how problems in one country can affect others. There is an issue of growing inequality between rich and poor countries, which was touched on in Chapter 23. There's increasing conflict between the global South and global North over resources, over trade relationships and labor practices. There's some inequality within countries as well, including labor disputes in places like Mexico and China, which are used as examples in your book. And there's the growth of an anti-globalization movement culminating in protests against an organization called the World Trade Organization. So your book is going to talk about these in turn and explain why they are a result of globalization. Globalization and an American empire. The dominant nation in this global trade has been the United States, and there have been some issues both for the U.S. and other countries. There has been a lot of influence for the U.S., but not in the degree that the colonial powers were during the time of imperialism. And they're going to go over some pros and cons of this influence of the United States. It's going to touch on the military power. Each of these dots is some military presence of the United States overseas in the 20th century. It's also going to talk about the cultural influence of the U.S., issues the U.S. is having with a trade deficit, which means we sell fewer products than we buy. And also it's going to talk about the good things that are resulting from American influence overseas. The next heading is about feminism. From its beginnings in Europe and the United States, the feminist movement spread around the world, adapting to fit local cultural beliefs. Feminism in the West. In the West, feminism started in the 60s and was more radical than it had been when women were trying to get the right to vote. This is a picture of a protest against the Miss America pageant in 1968, in which women are protesting against the whole concept of a beauty pageant. Often, the feminist movement in the West was focused more on education and employment and on challenging the established cultural norms, for instance, beauty pageants. Next, the book goes on to talk about feminism in the global South, and in some cases, women saw the feminist movement from the West, or the global North, as a form of cultural imperialism, as trying to enforce Western cultures. So women in these countries often got involved in feminist movements that were more political in nature. These are women protesting the government in Brazil. Your book will discuss Brazil, Chile, and South Korea as examples of more political feminism. Generally, in the global South, and really around the world, feminist movements reflect the values of that nation. So we'll talk about the fact that in Kenya, they touched on a tradition of women's groups. The next heading is called International Feminism. And as international organizations like the United Nations became involved in feminist causes, it kind of highlighted culture clashes. This is a picture of an international women's conference, and there was some resistance to various efforts internationally to promote the cause of feminism, such as in the Islamic world, which resisted openness about sexuality and about the legal rights of women. So one of the challenges has been to address the needs of women on a global stage while still respecting individual cultures and values. Next, the book turns its attention to religion in the globalization world. Globalization has continued the spread of major religions around the world, affecting societies culturally, politically, and socially. Fundamentalism on a global scale. In many places, religious believers have felt their beliefs threatened by an emphasis on science and secular culture. So fundamentalism refers to an uncompromising focus on the core beliefs and values of a religion. In the 20th century, it's flourished in many places. Christian fundamentalism in the United States, Hindu fundamentalism in India, and Islamic fundamentalism across the Muslim world are three examples your book will discuss. Creating Islamic societies. So in the 20th century, Islam has been established as the dominant religion in North Africa and throughout the Middle East. As you can see on this map, the yellow countries are very low percentage Muslim, but everybody else is, in some degree, a dominant Muslim country, and the blue and the green shades are 50% or higher. So in many parts of the world, Western cultural influence has been seen as a direct threat to Islam, and a lot of countries have pursued a theocratic state that's based on the beliefs of Islam. So your book is going to discuss many examples of movements that attack national leaders, push for strict adherence to Muslim beliefs, or in the case of Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, directly targeted Western nations like the United States. In this case, fundamentalism has been inspired by the growing economic and cultural influence of the West. The last section on religion has to do with alternatives to fundamentalism, and it's a brief heading that basically points out that there are scholars in all the major religions who have opposed militant solutions and tried to bring diverse religions together. And this is a picture of delegates to a World Peace Summit. A famous example of this way of thinking is the Dalai Lama, who's the leader of Tibetan Buddhism. The last section talks about environmentalism. The global economy has increased the impact of humans on the environment, leading to the rise of the environmental movement. Global environment transformed. In this heading, there will be three main causes of this impact of humans on the environment. The first is population growth. Here's a different diagram showing the population growth in the second half of the 20th century. And you can see the numbers are huge. You're looking at an increase of over 3 times the population in about a 50-year period. And you can also see, again, as we've talked about the developing world being a huge portion of this population increase. So that's the first cause of humans' impact on the environment. The second is the increasing use of fossil fuels to power industrial economies around the world. And the three is the massive economic growth that was described in a previous heading. So each of these factors has had negative environmental consequences, which has led to something called the Green Movement to address those consequences. So the environmental movement was inspired by 19th century romantics like Wordsworth, and then renewed in the 60s in the United States. And from there it spread around the world in various ways. There were green parties that formed in Europe that would politically address these issues. One of the things that's happened with the environmental movement is it's exposed economic issues between developing nations and developed nations. And a lot of third world countries see environmental issues as the product of wasteful Western economies. This map shows in purple the carbon dioxide emissions of industrialized countries, and in yellow the proportion coming from the developing world. And you can see, despite the difference in population kind of being reversed, that it's the purple countries that are doing most of the carbon dioxide emissions, despite the fact that they have a smaller population. So what this movement has done is exposed an ongoing conflict between the global south and the global north, which basically is to what degree should the West continue to direct economic growth in other parts of the world. In other words, can we tell China to stop, to clean up their air pollution? Can we tell a nation in Africa that they need to stop polluting rivers? And so this is an issue that's been ongoing throughout the time of globalization. Okay, 10-second spice review. Feminist movements spread around the world, while transnational corporations had increasing global political influence. The flourishing global economy raised environmental concerns, and fundamentalism addressed the secularization of many societies. International institutions helped to facilitate economic globalization. The visual summary is pretty simple for this one. We're basically saying that globalization has highlighted 3 issues and led to 3 movements around the world. They are feminism, religious fundamentalism, and environmentalism. That's your chapter 24 overview. Happy reading!
Det finns fröjd i världen och sorg ibland. Det finns hopp i vår värld och ängslan minns än.